this evening, Robert Lomas, who is well known for his treatise on many, many aspects of Freemasonry. And this evening, it gives me great pleasure to welcome him here as our guest speaker. He's written extensively on Freemasonry, its history, particularly the link with the Royal Society and the contribution that Masons have made to science and to engineering in particular. And without any ado, I would hand over the meeting now to Robert.
Right, good evening, brethren. Thank you for inviting me to Bristol to talk about a subject very dear to my heart, Freemasonry and quantum physics. So I posed myself the question this evening, why should a quantum physicist take Freemasonry seriously? Because after all, we're just a bunch of old oddballs, aren't we, who roll up our trouser legs, give funny handshakes and wear strange pinnies in public. Surely it's got nothing to do with science or sensible people. But I want to talk a little bit about just how inspirational Freemasonry can be. And it's also a bit of a personal investigation into Freemasonry's insights into the mind of the great architect of the universe. Now, to join Freemasonry, you've got to be able to express a belief in some form of supreme being. But the nature of that belief is not usually probed. As long as you have a belief in a supreme force for order within the cosmos, it can take many forms. And one of the forms it can take is the triangular form shown there, which is actually a physicist's view of the world, having a belief in the laws of physics. So, let's start with the second question. Must a scientist be an atheist? Now, we all know there is no God and that Richard Dawkins is his prophet. But you have to remember that Dawkins is a biologist, and biology is to physics like bird watching is to rocket science. So, he doesn't really understand the hidden mysteries of nature and science. So let's hear from some physicists. Let's start with Brother Enrico Fermi. At the age of 22, in La Giordano Lemmi in Rome, Enrico Fermi was asked, in all times of trial and difficulty, in whom do you put your trust? And he replied, in God. Albert Einstein said, I'm not an atheist, I'm a little child entering a huge library filled with books in many languages. I dimly suspect a mysterious order in the arrangements of the books, but I don't know what it is. That is the attitude of even the most intelligent human being towards God. We see the universe marvelously arranged and obeying laws, but only dimly understand those laws. And look at the symbol he's standing in front of. It's a hydrogen atom. But you could interpret it as the view of the centre if you wished. And then what about Werner Heisenberg? He said, Christian philosophy put God so far above the world that one began to consider the world without seeing God in it. Then a new authority appeared, the authority of empirical fact. It spoke of two revelations of God, one in the Bible and the other in nature. Nature is the immediate expression of God's intentions. Or Erwin Schrödinger. Now he's the man who discovered the equation for the wave function of the hydrogen atom, and he shared a Nobel Prize with Paul Dirac from Bristol, who also discovered the wave function of the positron, which we'll talk about later. Schrödinger said, no personal God can form part of a world model that has only become accessible at the cost of removing everything personal from it. We know when God is experienced, this is an event as real as an immediate sense perception or as of one's own personality. Like them, he must be missing in the space-time picture. I do not find God anywhere in space and time, for God is spirit. What about Paul Dirac? Paul Dirac wasn't a Mason, but he said, God is a mathematician of a very high order. And he used very advanced mathematics in constructing his universe. Incidentally, notice the symbols again. What about Richard Feynman? Richard Feynman said, that with more knowledge comes a deeper, more wonderful mystery, luring one to penetrate deeper still. With pleasure and confidence we turn over each new stone to find unimagined strangeness, leading on to more wonderful questions and mysteries. And he then went on to add, few unscientific people have this particular type of religious experience because we don't yet live in a scientific age. Stephen Hawking, not noted for his interest in the existence of a supreme being, has actually written about it. He said, I left the question of the existence of a supreme being completely open. It would be perfectly consistent to say that there was a being who was responsible for the laws of physics. However, it could be misleading to call this being God, because this term is normally understood to have personal connotations, which are not present in the laws of physics. What about Fred Hoyle? He's a Yorkshire lad. And of course Tony is master of a Yorkshire lodge, so we had to bring a Yorkshire physicist into it. He said, God is a forbidden word in science, but if we define an intelligence superior to ourselves as a deity, then we have arrived at two kinds. The intelligence of other evolved intelligent observers elsewhere in the cosmos, and the God of the infinite future. But what I cannot understand is why a God who has no need of the world should have reason to create it. But this is avoided when God exists only by virtue of the support received from the universe. We've heard from some physicists, we've heard from a biologist. I found one biologist who said there was no God, and a whole string of physicists who thought some form of order existed, different views on its nature. But let's look at the inspiration from Freemasonry's past. Where did these physicists learn their trade? Well, the science of physics that Fred Hoyle practiced to a very high level grew out of two people closely involved with Freemasonry. John Wallis was a Mason, and Isaac Newton might have been, but he was certainly highly influenced by the thoughts of Freemasons. They were both inspired by an injunction now given in the second degree of Freemasonry to study the hidden mysteries of nature and science to better know the great architect. Now, the route to spiritual understanding is sometimes blocked to physicists by devout religious believers because they insist on a need to accept things which seem to be superstitious or theological nonsense to scientists. But Freemasonry provides a more tolerant route to spiritual understanding which appeals greatly to scientists, and that's through its study and the use of symbols. So I want to talk for a little while about symbols. Symbols have an enormous power. Jung studied symbols, and I've got a quote from him there, as the mind explores the symbol, it is led to ideas that lie beyond the grasp of reason. Because there are innumerable things beyond the range of human understanding, we constantly use symbolic terms to represent concepts that we cannot define or fully comprehend. And that, of course, is how Freemasonry works. It's a peculiar system of morality veiled in allegory and illustrated by symbols. And the symbols are an important part of our Freemasonry. Let's look at the man who really made symbols popular. That's Brother John Wallis, Savilian Professor of Geometry in Oxford, founder member of the Royal Society, and he was one of the first people to realize that symbols could be used to represent events in the real world and could be manipulated in order to understand the real world. And when he passed this knowledge on to his brethren in the Royal Society, it opened up a whole new range of possibilities. He discovered something called the power of equality. Now, there's an incredible mystery within the simple equations that you all learnt at school. And the symbolic power of equations comes from two key factors. Firstly, a symbol can be used to represent anything that's real. So you can use it to work out the speed a stone falls if you drop it, or you can work out the number of gulps of air that a man can breathe in a diving bell before running out of oxygen. It's versatile. But the equality described by an equation is total, absolute, and uncompromising. And John Wallis discovered this, and this science is called algebra. Now, if you think about the equal sign, you see where he got his idea from. If you take two pillars representing the equality of the priest and the king, Boaz the king and Jachin the priest, and if you rotate them through an angle of 90 degrees or the fourth part of a circle, you have the equal sign. John Wallis introduced the equal sign into mathematics and introduced the rules by which it was used to deduce truth about reality. So, effectively, the treatise of algebra could reveal the hidden secrets of nature. Wallis explained how symbols can uncover matters which are otherwise inaccessible to human understanding. And he noted that a symbolic equation had the power to uncover the mechanisms of nature, which is, of course, what you are encouraged to do as a fellowcraft Freemason. Now, the name he chose for accessing this hidden power was algebra, and he took the word from the Arabic, and it means to bring together. He inspired Newton. He taught Newton, and also he brought Newton into the Royal Society. Now, the Royal Society was a very lively group of thinkers, and many of them were Freemasons. So they were pre-sensitized to symbols, and the Royal Society gave them money, encouragement, and a journal to share their knowledge. Now, without this freedom to study the works of the great architect, Newton's ideas about knowing the mind of God through the symbolic equations which control the movements of the heavens would never have been published, and we would have no modern science. So Wallis and Newton, between them, founded science for us. Now let's look at the Masonic inspiration that Newton had. In his first term at Cambridge, he bought a copy of that book, Christian Astrology, which was written by Freemason William Lilly. You can find Lilly's a Freemason because he attended a lodge that Ashmole did, and Ashmole wrote about it. Newton struggled to understand that book because it involved two branches of symbolic reasoning that he wasn't familiar with. One was geometry and the other was trigonometry. So that forced him to study the writings of John Wallis, because John Wallis provided ways to analyze these things through his treatise on algebra. And Wallis then suggested that Newton look at the works of Euclid. And reading Wallis, he was then led to the ideas of William Oughtred, who was another early Freemason. And here a little dining out note for you, brethren. The slide rule is a Masonic invention. It was invented by Freemason William Oughtred in order to simplify the calculations of the movements of the heavenly spheres. Let's see what Newton had to say. We know God only by his most wise and excellent contrivances of things and final causes. Blind metaphysical necessity could produce no variety of things. All that diversity of natural things which we find suited to different times and places could arise from nothing but the ideas and will of a being necessarily existing. Thus, the diligent student of science, the earnest seeker of truth, is led to the courts of a sacred temple, wherein, at each step, new wonders meet the eye, till as a crowning grace, they stand before the Holy of Holies and learn that all science and all truth are one. Perhaps he was a fellowcraft Freemason. There's an interesting Masonic plot involved with Newton. He got involved in a tremendous dispute with the German philosopher Leibniz. They both claimed to have discovered calculus at the same time and separately, and they argued about who'd got there first. But the interesting thing is both Newton and Leibniz were exposed to the same symbolic teaching by Freemasons of the Royal Society. Newton through his association with John Wallis and reading Lilly and Oughtred, and Leibniz through a protracted correspondence with brother Sir Robert Murray, the Freemason who actually founded the Royal Society. So the ideas that led to Principia Mathematica and the science of fluxon and the science of calculus came out of Masonic symbolic reasoning. So let's look at a few more little hidden mysteries. This symbolic mix of geometry and algebraic analysis, which is the calculus, appeared simultaneously to two men as if it had been fully formed in another place, and was just waiting for a chance to manifest in human minds. Now, Masonic teaching offers a means of accessing this place where symbols are eternally present, and it's called by physicists the Platonic Heaven. We believe that mathematical theories are not invented, they are discovered, and they pre-exist. And they exist in a Platonic heaven of perfect forms. And there is the symbol for it, the material world, the world of the mind, both accessing the Platonic world of perfect forms and perfect symbols. Now, Wallace, Lilly and Ortrud introduced Newton to this tradition, which has since become commonplace among modern scientists. Like Plato, that's Plato there, waving his finger in the air. Like Plato, Wallace and Newton believed that pure symbols arose from the mind of God, existed before the world began, and will endure long after the world has passed into oblivion. Let's look at a more modern inspiration of Freemasonry. In the past, it's led us to algebra, it's led us to calculus, but it's also had an influence in the 20th century. Implicit in this eternal worldview is the idea that for a mathematical theorem to be discovered, it must already exist before any human mind thinks about it. So this idea of transcendental world of absolute symbolic forms was produced by that Greek philosopher, Plato, about 2,500 years ago in Greece. Now, if you look at what physicists say, Roger Penrose is a leading physicist from Cambridge, and he says about this, the Platonic viewpoint is an immensely valuable one. It tells us to be careful to distinguish the precise mathematical entities from approximations that we see around us in the world of physical things. Moreover, it provides us with the blueprint according to which modern science has proceeded. So this idea that we have within Freemasonry about perfect forms and symbols has inspired modern science. And when you're working with symbols, this underlies the whole philosophy of science and gives rise to the term research. When a scientist conducts research, he repeats a search which can be carried out by anyone independently to discover a truth about the nature of reality that's open to anyone prepared to interact with the Platonic symbols. That's CERN's Large Hadron Collider, incidentally. I just stuck it in because I thought it looked rather pretty. And this, of course, is one of the aims of Freemasonry. You interact with symbols to learn about truth. Now, let me give you a frightful proof of this. During World War II, the scientists Leon Szilard and Albert Einstein in the UK and Niels Bohr, in the US, and Niels Bohr in the UK realized that a weapon of immense destructive power already existed within the realms of symbolic truth. The implication of this thought was that a frightful weapon was sitting, waiting to be found by the first bold searcher to discover it and let it help them win the war. It was there for the taking. All you had to do was look for it. And that searcher could be on either side of the war. Szilard and Einstein wrote to President Roosevelt, urging him to devote all the US's scientific talent to searching for this atomic bomb, which they believed existed already. They warned that the consequences of Hitler getting there first would be catastrophic. Unfortunately, Roosevelt was a Freemason, and he took their warning seriously because he understood about the nature of symbolic truth and the fact that symbols had an eternal verity about them. And he set up the Manhattan Project. The outcome was two new types of bomb, a uranium bomb called Little Boy and a plutonium bomb, which was based on the work of Brother Enrico Fermi, who discovered how to make plutonium, which was called Fat Boy. The result was the end of World War II. Now, a dire warning, brethren. Be careful what you wish for. If you ever doubt that individuals who learn to understand symbols have the power to change the world, if you ever doubt that individuals who learn to understand symbols have the power to change the world, then remember the dreadful proof of the 6th of August, 1945. That's what's left of Hiroshima after that date. the bomb was real. Even though it was purely a symbolic thought, it was real, it was discovered, it worked, and it still worked. If you understand symbols, you have the power to change reality. So symbols are the key to science. Nobody now questions the idea that there are symbolic scientific entities just waiting in the Platonic Heaven to be discovered by explorers who know how to reach them. The atom bomb is harrowing proof of this. And Freemasonry has 600 years' experience of studying symbols, which it can share with scientists and help inspire them. And it's why I joined Freemasonry, to learn more about symbols from the craft. Now, let's talk a little bit about the future. Freemasonry tells me that deep within me, at the center of my being, there is a divine spark which allows me to link with the great architect. And in his book, The Meaning of Masonry, Brother Walter Wilmshurst, who was the founder of my own lodge, wrote, "At the depths of our being there resides nothing other than a spark of the great architect eminent within us." One of the scariest and most wonderful things about quantum physics is that when you decide to observe certain aspects of an experiment, you create the past of that experiment. Physics says that at the center of my mind there is a small part of my consciousness that interacts with reality and brings about an outcome of any particular experiment I decide to carry out. And my intentions matter. That's exactly what Freemasonry tells me, using slightly different language. Fred Hoyle agrees with this, because he said, certainty comes into an individual experiment only after it has actually been done, and certainty comes only by observing the outcome of a particular experiment with our consciousness telling us the result. And here's the shocking bit. It comes as something of a shock to find one's consciousness being involved in this way. And many scientists, while accepting the basic ideas of quantum physics, try to avoid the involvement of consciousness. But you can't. I made a very good living about 30 years ago by conning electrons. I used to sneak up on them and measure their energy, and when I did that, they were forced to jump to another place. And they jumped very, very quickly. And so as a result, I was able to make devices which would resonate at a very high frequency for making radar. They're called Izaki diodes. And it's done purely by making use of this fact. I decided to measure the electron's energy. The Heisenberg uncertainty principle says I can't know its energy and its position. So once I knew its energy, the poor little electron was forced to jump to another place instantaneously, without passing in the space before, without passing go, and without collecting 200 pounds. It works. This is not imagination, this is how reality is manipulated. And you can call it a spark within my soul, or you can call it a part within my consciousness, or you can call it an interaction between the neuron activity in my brain and the quantum wave function. Whatever it is, whatever language you use, it works. So, quantum physics tells me that when I decide to observe something, I can change the nature of the reality I'm observing. I can actually set off two possible particles on different paths and not decide until the very last moment what to measure, and in doing so, I can affect the previous past of those particles. I can affect where they went in the past. So the thing is, if you look back deep into the origins of the universe, where you look at light that's very, very old, and you observe events that have never before been observed, you can collapse the wave functions. So effectively, you can change the past. So by observing as a physicist, I interact with reality and modify it forever and throughout all space-time. But most importantly, there are choices in this process which are affected by my intentions as an observer. So by studying the nature of the divine spark, as Freemasonry teaches me, and learning to know myself, and learning to apply it in a manner which is for the good of society, then I can also learn about the nature of quantum wave function collapse. So let's go a little more into the hidden mysteries. Let's look at the triangular mystery of the quark's domestic life. Quantum physics tells me that there are particles which make up subatomic particles, but you cannot separate them out. So just as I can't separate my divine spark from my consciousness without killing myself in the process, so I can't separate quarks out of protons and neutrons. I'm sure you all know that atoms are made up largely of empty space. They've got a nucleus which has protons and neutrons in various arrangements within them, and electrons orbiting around them, rather like small planets. Now, when you look inside those basic subatomic particles, the proton and the neutron, you'll find they're made up of a range of 9 different objects called quarks. Now, effectively the most important ones are the up quarks and the down quarks. 2 up quarks and a down quark will make a proton, and it has a charge of +1 electron, and 2 down quarks and an up quark will make a neutron, which has no charge whatsoever. The shape of them, they form a balanced equilateral triangle. Sometimes the blue up quark, because they do actually have colour and charm as well, but I'm not going to go into that tonight. The blue quark can sometimes change to become a green down quark, and when it does, it emits a positron. Now, a positron is a positively charged electron. I'm sure Brother Tony has looked inside people's head with positive electron tomography. So we know they work. And the positron was the great discovery of Paul Dirac. That's what got him his Nobel Prize. Because nobody had ever seen a positron. Because the moment a positron finds an electron, they immediately meld together and give off a great puff of energy, which manifests itself as neutrinos and photons of heat and light, and dissipate. So you can't separate these things. But strangely enough, the symbol for the deity that Freemasonry has taught me is also the symbol for the nuclear force, which binds the quarks together within the subatomic particles. Interesting. Why are they called quarks, though? Well, it's his fault. That guy, Murray Gell-Mann, named these strange triangular subnuclear particles quarks after a quote from Finnegan's Wake that intrigued him. 3 quarks for Mr. Mark is the quote. It takes 3 quarks to make a fermion. So, interestingly enough, the subatomic particles are named after a Freemason, Brother Enrico Fermi. Let's just have another little look, though, before we move away from this, at how you investigate how quarks interact. That's a Feynman diagram. Richard Feynman discovered it, and he applied Euclid geometry to Paul Dirac's wave function and discovered he could predict the interaction of quarks and could work out exactly what would result when a particular set of quarks, whether they were bound in neutrons or protons, came together. And it also involves the transfer of things called virtual electrons and positrons. Now, incidentally, another little piece of information about Richard Feynman: he married a girl from Yorkshire who lived in Kebroyd in Ripponden, and he played the bongo drums in the Queen's Head pub in Ripponden in the 1970s. And I did actually see him there. Well, that's another story. He isn't mainly known for the skill of his bongo playing, but for his Nobel Prize for developing the Feynman diagrams. But nevertheless, he was no mean bongo player. Let's look how Brother Fermi has been honoured. The first quarks to be found experimentally were at a new laboratory called Fermilab, and that was created as a permanent memorial to the scientific insight of Brother Enrico Fermi. There he is on a US stamp, standing in front of a nice circular diagram. And this is a part of the citation that was put forward when they dedicated the Fermilab laboratory to him. And listen to it, and then think, is there a better description of a fellowcraft Freemason? To explore the hidden mysteries of nature with Enrico Fermi was always a great adventure and a thrilling experience. He had a sure way of starting off in the right direction, of setting aside the irrelevancies, of seizing all the essentials and proceeding to the core of the matter. The whole process of wresting from nature her secrets was for Fermi an exciting sport, which he entered into with supreme confidence and great zest. And he drew his inspiration from the symbolic thinking of Freemasonry. Now I thought, to close, I would explore from a physics viewpoint the mystery of making darkness visible. We all know that Master Masons are very concerned with darkness visible. We know that it's important to us in the third degree, but do we know how real it is? Just as the sun rises in the east to open and enliven the day, so is the worshipful Master placed in the east to open the lodge and employ and instruct his brethren in Freemasonry. But what is the hidden mystery of nature and science that enables the sun to pour enormous amounts of light and energy into the dark space surrounding it and so warm the earth to a livable temperature? It's an interesting mystery. If it didn't happen, we wouldn't be here talking about it. Let's consider the sun as a poor candidate in a state of darkness. That up there is not a symbol of the centre, although there's a circumference and the point at the centre is equidistant from every point in the circumference, but it's actually a diagram of the building blocks of the sun, the dark gas hydrogen. So before the sun was formed, 4.5 billion years ago, the space it now occupies was dark and cold, but it contained wisps of that element, the most common element in the universe, hydrogen. And hydrogen has one proton in its nucleus and one electron buzzing around it. Now, there's nothing simpler in the whole of creation than a hydrogen atom. You know, it has been said that the great architect was enormously fond of beetles because he happened to make something like 500,000 different species of them, but he made an awful lot more atoms of hydrogen. It permeates the whole of the cosmos. And it's a very simple thing. It's not a showy element, so you can't really see it when it's a thinly spread gas in the dark and cold of outer space. However, if you get enough hydrogen in one place, then gravity starts to work on it, and it pulls it into a ball which grows and pulls in more hydrogen. And then you see a faint glimmer of light. As it's compressed under its own weight, it starts to heat up. You can see how this sort of thing happens. If you pump up a bicycle tyre, you'll notice the pump gets hot. In the same way, if you compress a ball of hydrogen gas, it starts to get hot. Now, as this ball of dark black hydrogen sucks in more mass, first the electrons get stripped away from the protons, and then the quarks get really upset. Because all the protons are being pushed together, and they've all got positive charges, they don't want to be pushed together, so they jiggle about. And if you push them together tightly enough, then you actually knock quarks out of them. And some of the up quarks take their bats home and turn into down quarks, and in doing so they give off positrons. And now the darkness starts to become visible as the pressure changes the hydrogen into helium. Now, helium is a more complicated thing than hydrogen. It has a nucleus which contains 2 neutrons, 2 protons, and has 2 electrons buzzing around the outside of it. Let's consider what happens when the great architect decrees that a mass of hydrogen shall come close together. If we start with 4 atoms of hydrogen, we've got 4 protons and 4 electrons. Now, we've no neutrons at all. But if we cram them all together, some of the up quarks take their bat home, flip into down quarks and give off positrons. So to make 1 atom of helium, we need 2 protons, 2 neutrons and 2 electrons. I'm not going to go through the 4 conversion processes. I'll give you the equations because Brother Tony forbid me to use equations, and I have been fairly true to that, even though the physicists I've shown have all been stood in front of blackboards with them on them. So During this mystical conversion, which you'll have to take my word for, because I'm not allowed to show you the equations for it, we find we've created 2 positrons and 2 discarded free electrons. Now, if you remember, I told you about positrons and electrons earlier. They have equal and opposite charges and equal and opposite masses, and if you let a positron hit an electron, then they disappear in a great puff of neutrinos and photons. Now, it's the neutrinos and photons of light and heat that brighten up and enliven the day. And without that process, we wouldn't be here. Why do I take Freemasonry seriously? 3 reasons. Freemasonry teaches me that symbols can convey messages which transcend and exceed the limitations of words. It tells me that there's a commonly accessible transcendental region where all the symbolic knowledge about reality lies waiting to be discovered. It calls it awareness of the center. And it also tells me that individuals can work together to understand and access this symbolic repository and use the knowledge they gain to understand, manipulate and contribute to reality. And that gives purpose to their lives. That gives purpose to our lives. So by working together, the lodge is greater than the sum of its individual parts. And it takes all sorts of Masons to form a lodge, but the fact that we are tolerant of all the views and we share the things we have in common rather than arguing about the things we differ over helps us understand much more about the world if we work together in a spirit of brotherly love. To close, I thought I would give you a reading from my volume of the Sacred Law. It's taken from Genesis chapter 1 verse 1, and it says, God decreed E equals mc squared, P equals mf, open brackets, h crossed squared divided by 2m del squared plus v multiplied by phi is equal to I h crossed, the first derivative with respect to, partial derivative with respect to time of phi, and there was light. Thank you, brethren.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, then please click the subscribe box in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen.